Our next speaker is Celia Smoot, who most recently served as the Senior Program Officer for LISC's Preservation and Housing Team. Celia is an attorney with real estate finance background, and she has devoted her career to affordable housing and community development work. Welcome, Celia.
So I was going to start off with this whole conversation about the need for affordable housing, but I realized it was kind of like fishing in a barrel because everyone in here probably already agrees with that. So one of the things that my topic is to talk about, can state and local government innovate for affordable housing? And more I thought about it, the topic really should be state and local government needs to innovate for affordable housing. It's pretty clear that they can do it. So how do we get there? And how do we get to the point where state and local government really need to take the leadership role in solving our affordable housing issues? Well, as we talk about the history of funding for affordable housing, do we think that past is prologue? It's not, right? So the history of affordable housing financing was that there was 25 years of the federal government providing $60 billion to affordable housing. This was direct capital dollars to build a lot of this kind of preservation projects that we're focusing on today. The low-income housing tax credit program started in 1987, made investments, created 2.3 million units of affordable housing. That's great. That's when a lot of support and resources were coming from the federal government for affordable housing. However, this is where we're going now. We're seeing how resources are slowly going away. Now, we think about budgets. We think about HUD's budget in particular. The latest president's budget for the agency shows about a $9 billion decrease in funding, right? So a lot of the historic programs that we looked at in terms of funding affordable housing, new construction and preservation, eliminated. CDBG eliminated. Home eliminated. Public Housing Capital Fund eliminated. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is, I don't know how to do this. This is what happens when none of it. Okay. The good news is that that budget's probably dead on arrival, right? We know that state and Senate, during Secretary's testimony to Congress, pretty much said that this budget's dead on arrival. For the last 2 years, there's been a push to eliminate those programs, and in all those times, those programs have been funded. However, if you look over the years of those programs, there has been definitely a dip and definitely a decrease in funding overall. Now, one of the responses the Secretary gave, like, why did you eliminate these programs in your budget? And the response was because those programs were funding things that states and local government should really focus on. Now, when I heard that, I kind of turned into the real-life version of that GIF of the woman kind of staring into space, really confused with all the math equations floating around her head. Because if you take away all the funding, how are the state and local governments going to do those programs? Anyway, I went and got myself some Oreo cookies and it kept going. But what is very clear is that when we think about our partnerships with our state and local municipal partners and the leadership that's necessary there, it is very, very clear that ways that we innovate have to have this perfect, magical recipe of leadership, good policy, and resources. This is what happens when I don't know. So we talk a lot about where's the cost burden. Where do we focus our energies around affordable housing? We typically look at between the renter market and basically entry-level, moderate income families looking at for home ownership. Those are where our two focuses are. And those are the areas that we have to innovate, right? So not only do we have to think about where do we bring the capital dollars in order to focus on creating and preserving affordable housing, right? So the actual build money, we have to think about where that subsidy money comes from in order to create the subsidy needed for families to not be so incredibly cost burdened. There are 8 million families who are, this is HUD's own study, 8 million families who are severely cost burdened. That means 50% of their take home goes to keeping a roof over their head, or they live in very distressed housing conditions. So we think about where are the type of municipalities that are thinking about ways to get at very specific solutions and where they need to innovate their policies and their resources in order to address a very specific affordable housing problem. I'm going to start with a city in the Midwest. As we all know, a lot of the Midwest housing topography, which in some ways is very reflective of the South as well, is that there's a lot of investment have been made over years in the single-family housing industry, right? So we have a lot of like single-family residential neighborhoods. We saw in the downturn a huge increase, and I'm sorry, I'm a Southerner, so I'm a close talker because all you folks in the front are going to constantly have me walking up towards you. We saw a huge influx of or increases in foreclosures. And that foreclosure led to vacancy, led to blight into residential neighborhoods. But what it also resulted in was the lack of housing for low-income and moderate families to actually achieve home ownership. So now we have a credit crisis, we have a credit crunch, and we have a lack of inventory. So how do we solve that problem? How a local government looks at that issue and solves the problem? There had to be, again, leadership. And there was incredible leadership out of the city manager's office, incredible leadership out of the Housing Community Development Department. There had to be good policy, right? So how do we look at ways that we are addressing foreclosures in the city, ways that we are creating the inventory, and ways that we are alleviating that inventory, or basically doing single-family reclamation of that inventory. The third, resources, right? It doesn't magically happen without money, right? So let's be clear, resources generally about money. So you have a city that had limited resources of your typical type of ecosystem and how we address, in this particular case, single-family housing, right? You would look at home and CDBG, and again, those dollars are shrinking. There was definitely political will to address the issue, but those resources, as you can imagine, were already dedicated to certain programs that the city was invested in and needed to continue to fund. So we had to find new money. So where were we going to find that? We needed to find new dollars. And it literally came down to, well, we have this, but we can't use that. We have this, we can't use that. And eventually, sitting in a meeting, like, well, what do you got? Like, where can we find the resources? And we realized it became a question of how do we innovate what we actually have? So they actually literally looked through the city's financing. And I suspect after this exercise that every city probably has this, years and years of programming and things that folks in the finance world would know called escrows and deposits and all different types of dollars kind of sitting at a city's books that for programs they hadn't run in like 10 years. So we realized after we were going through this exercise, we accumulated roughly about $5 million of city resources that were just completely not being utilized. So there is a way to innovate those dollars, a way to kind of create a better utilization of those dollars. And that became the catalyst and the credit enhancement to attract $10 million of local bank capital. Local bank capital that then created a $15 million fund that will then be invested into creating not only acquisition dollars, but construction dollars for low and moderate families in order to basically acquire a vacant property. So then we're addressing that inventory issue, vacant properties that were sitting in the land bank, and to work with local contractors to rehab those buildings and provide the long-term permanent financing that those homeowners need. So we also try to address the credit issue with that one innovation. Other markets, affordable housing. How do we look at our ability to create mobility and diversity in our neighborhoods? Mobility and diversity among the people living together. I think that we all in the industry focus a lot on what do we need to do to address affordability although we tend to kind of focus it in a bit of a vertical sense. We think about families at 30% AMI below, families at 50% AMI below, families at 60% AMI and below. However, affordability is an issue that's more of a horizon. And I think that we as an industry have to talk about affordability in a much more inclusive way, and one in which there are no winners and there are no losers. So economic mobility is incredibly important. Economic diversity becomes incredibly important if we're trying to address a very holistic and comprehensive approach of how we address affordable housing, which means when you have a market like Charlotte that is growing dramatically, that has a very, very clear need for affordable housing, but also to address economic mobility, you have to think about how you are building that housing opportunity in a way that is inclusive. So, mixed income transactions, mixed income developments that allows for a horizon of AMI families living together. Now, that means that our typical ecosystem, our typical financial ecosystem for affordable housing is not built to allow that in a very perfect sense. There are some different ways that we're looking at it: income averaging and low-income housing tax credits, the idea of trying to do 80-20 transactions where 80% is market and 20% is affordable. We are moving there, but we're not quite there, which means that we had to not only think about as working with the city, trying to figure out what is a tool, right, and what is the right policy that was going to allow more economic mobility and the resources in order to address that. So one, we had to figure out a resource that's going to be outside of our typical ecosystem. So no longer housing tax credits, right? So allow that resource to continue funding other projects, but in this particular case, and for this particular outcomes, let's not cannibalize that resource. Secondly, how do we get different type of funding partners at the table? We know that we typically are working with financial institutions. We're typically working with other types of kind of financial partners, something like life companies, other type of financial institutions that have a need for investment. But the one important thing that we learned here, and one important thing we learned by working with the city and their leadership, was that neighbors want to help neighbors. So how do you bring in what we call your high net worth individual, and not just because of the idea there's opportunity zone investment. It's not the manna from heaven as we all think of it. It is a tool, but it's not the tool that's going to change people's commitment to their partners, to their neighbors. So in this particular case, it's the idea of bringing in unconventional financing partners, a city looking at their ability to have their constituency all kind of back a particular type of resource. In this particular case, the city was able to get passage of a $50 million bond that was going to allow them to make an investment in affordable housing. And how did we look at other partners? The local foundation, a local foundation that's made an incredible amount of strides in the city in addressing a plethora of different issues, but had never really looked at their partnership in that particular way, taking a policy and taking a resource leadership. So bringing all of those partners together, coming up with a resource that would make investments into developments with partners on the ground to create varied mixed income housing in areas of opportunity throughout the city of Charlotte. That would not have happened. It would not have started without that first commitment from the city to make their commitment to their resources, and not only make their commitment to their resource, but doing it outside of your typical kind of funding ecosystem around affordable housing. And my final example is Live Denver. That is a local-based rental subsidy program that's funded with the city's leadership, the Housing Authority, the Denver Housing Authority, as well as corporate partners. What does this do? What was the issue that was trying to be solved? Remember, we talked again about affordable housing being a horizon issue in which we know there are some resources for certain segments of our communities, and there are no resources available that for people who are in need in our communities. Particularly where that issue is most acute is in the rental subsidy area, right? So you have a growing city. They have a particular cottage industry, as you can imagine, that's attracting a lot of people, and there's a lot of income there and not really a place for it to go. They have legal weed, okay. And so you have an increased housing affordability crisis. And yet you have a huge influx of very high income housing that was being built in the city because builders were thinking, I'm going to project this and there's going to be all this income that's going to come in. But it didn't quite work out that way. So you have this level of vacancy in the center city of Denver with high-end market rate projects, and yet you have a whole bunch of people whose income didn't match or make those units affordable for them. So what does the city do? The city takes a chunk of capital, and they say, we're going to use this to seed a local-based subsidy program. We're going to figure out a way that we're going to house individuals. We're going to address this vacancy issue in the kind of high market product. And how can we do that with our partnerships? So this is another way of, again, single family, multifamily production, rental subsidy. These are all issues that have to be solved, and those issues have to be solved by state and local government. State and local government needs to be a leadership in that role, and there's definitely ways to look at this differently and look at the work that we're all doing differently and innovate and figure out ways that we all as partners are comprehensively addressing this. Again, you cannot do it all alone. No, city and state government need all of you to partner with them in order to achieve those. So I'm getting the